As long as people have been living and dying, people have been there to support each other through grieving. But my next guest does it for a living. She's a death doula. A death doula helps families handle the non-medical aspects of end-of-life care. It's a profession that came into the scene in the U.S. around 2017. But death support and its rituals have existed in nearly every culture throughout time. It's only in the more recent human timeline that we have struggled to reconcile our life with our death. As the founder of the Center of Sacred Death Care, she's going to help us with the how and the why of talking about death to ourselves, to others, and to the dying, as we ask the question, does talking about death have to be morbid? Death partner, soul honorer, and goodness finder, Dr. Sarah Kerr. Thanks for being here.
It's lovely to be here, Meredith. Thanks for having me.
I want to start with something that I've heard you say, and that's that death isn't pretty, but it's beautiful. Can you explain that?
You know, another way I often say that is death is hard and sad. That's built into it, but it doesn't have to be as hard and as sad as we make it in Western culture. In fact, even though it's hard, it can be beautiful. Giving birth is hard, and it can also be incredibly and exquisitely beautiful. There's something that happens when the veil opens, as it were. So death is hard, but we can make it beautiful. We can make it meaningful. We can make it significant. We can make it an opportunity to feel more connected to each other, to ourselves, to whatever we hold sacred in the world, whatever that might be. We have choices. We're not just at the mercy of the experience. We have choices about how we go through it, and those choices can bring more beauty, more grace, more love, more meaning.
That's such a good point about when we give birth. That is a hard process. All of it is hard, but we're allowed to talk about it. I mean, they announce it. I'm pregnant, and then everyone chimes in with sentiments, but also advice and communal support. Oh, this happened to me. I used this doctor. I mean, even sharing of those resources, right? Wouldn't it be so helpful to live in a world where we could announce, I guess, like, hey, I'm on my way out. And the community would respond with, hey, I found this person very helpful for this resource, and I found that resource really helpful for my family. I guess that's sort of like a fantasy.
Well, I think it's happening. People call it by different names, the death positivity movement, this idea. And the parallel to birth is not a surprising one, because it's really being led in many ways by parents who had babies with midwives 40 years ago. Now they're dying, and they're saying, look, I did this my way when I came in, when I brought my children into the world. Now I want to go out the same way. So it's boomers really who are changing the structure around this.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it is. And death is taboo, right? We don't talk about it, but we mostly, I think, in many ways, don't talk about it because we're afraid of it. We don't understand it. We're scared of it. And as long as we keep something over there where we can't see it and can't talk about it, we can't learn how to do it better. So this new movement that's coming forward, death doulas are part of that, is all about bringing it back up, as you do with your work, into the cultural consciousness so we can address it, destigmatize it, and then make some choices and learn how to do it better. We learn how to die the same way we learn how to raise our kids, how to communicate, how to eat well. Those are all life skills that we should learn from our community, if it's doing its job.
To use the birth analogy again, there's that book everyone mentions and laughs about, What to Expect When You're Expecting. There's this assuredness about the potentialities of giving birth. But when it comes to death, I think so much of it is unknown because it's not like people can really report back that, I don't know, it's like the unknown is uncomfortable. Is that like a modern thing, or is that a human thing?
When I talk and think and teach about death, the frame I use is that when we're alive, body and soul are together. And we know what that is. And as we die, body and soul separate. Body is finite. It can't hold us forever. At some point, it ages, it gets ill, it stops working. It goes back to the land. But soul continues. And so when I talk about soul, that's really in the biggest, most general sense of the word. You can interchange spirit, consciousness, essence, whatever resonates for people. It's not a dogmatic picture, but it's the idea that there's our physical self and then there's something else. And so the something else, in my experience, my teaching, my learning, it continues in some way. It's hard to know what that is, but it continues in some way. So death has a series of stages to it. It's when we're together, and then maybe through aging or illness, or maybe it's a sudden death. Body and soul separate. We know what happens to body, right? That's not unknown. We can track that process. We have medical professionals, people have been through that. But what happens to the soul is a little bit different. And your question was about, is that a Western issue or is that a human nature issue? And I think it's a Western cultural issue, that we have a very particular understanding of ourselves as physical beings. We know how to relate to ourselves as physical beings. We don't have as much language or understanding or teaching or conversation about our non-physical sense, that part that continues. But so many people I speak to and work with have had some inkling of someone they love continuing on. They've had a sensation, they've had a vision, they've had an image, they've had a visitation, they've had a dream, they've spoken to a medium, they've done a psychedelic journey, somewhere they've come back in. So the approach I take is that, yes, some part of us continues, and how do we learn about that? And the Center for Sacred Death Care is all about that process. What is the soul's journey? And we can learn about it, but we have to sort of refine in a Western context those understandings. Other cultures and different times and places have ways of understanding them. We need to find our own version of what that is. Near-death experiences teach us a lot. Research on reincarnation teaches us a lot. People's anecdotal experiences teach us a lot.
Oh, that's so true. And your PhD research, in fact, was kind of around that rediscovery of death ritual for Western folks in the modern age. I find when I look back at what I perceive to be my ancestral, history, which would be like Northern European, I always picture like a Viking woman on a ship with a bow and arrow. For some reason, like I have this very specific imagery in my mind. I can read about what her rituals would have been, but, burning a body and sending it out on a floating something into the water, it would just feel like I was copying something out of a book. It wouldn't resonate with me. How do you suggest people who are trying to find ritual find it in an authentic way that doesn't feel like they're just copying something?
So you're right. This was a big focus of my doctoral research, was looking at the foundational structures of ritual, the kind of archetypal architecture of how cultures all across the world and through time have approached these practices. There's an underlying structure, and then there's the way it's delivered. It's like Romeo and Juliet has an underlying structure. You could perform Romeo and Juliet surfer style in ancient Greece. You can perform it with lots of images or motifs around it, but the structure is the same. So what we're doing, my work and other people working in this field, are working to develop new ritual practices that follow that deep archetypal structure, because that's really wired in to all of us at a soul level. That's our shared human heritage, maybe more than human too. But then what does it look like? Well, your ancestors would have burned the ship and sent someone out. What does it look like if you're in an urban center? You have a bunch of people who have different kinds of backgrounds, who drive cars and have cell phones and aren't traditionally living on the land. Well, we can take that shared energetic structure and develop rituals that look like talking circles and sharing circles that happen around a coffee table in a living room after someone's died. How do we have a way to honor their grief, the family's grief, before the funeral? Right? The funeral's a ritual. We have that ritual. We can improve some of the parts of it. But one of the rituals I often do with people is a family storytelling circle between the death and the funeral. Because people are still in shock from the death, even if you know it's coming. And the funeral is quite a public, almost a performance for the family. It's not a grief ritual for the family. So we need a ritual in between, sometimes more than one, often more than one, that helps the family prepare for the funeral. And so those rituals look like 12 people in a living room around a coffee table with some tea and a candle and a talking object that was meaningful to that person or meaningful in this family, and the processes of allowing people to share their grief. It's a kind of grief ritual that is as powerful, or probably close to as powerful, as rituals that have a longer history. But we're redeveloping that in a way that's accessible for modern people.
Wow. So, how have you, in your experience, initiated that event with families? I mean, I know that's really getting into the granular, but I'm putting myself in the shoes of someone who has a family member who has just passed. It's these sorts of like business aspects of death that for definitely like type A personalities, they just take over, right? And so you kind of have a sharp eye on that finish line and you just get through it, right? And that's, not just type A's, I would say, probably for a lot of people, but their participation varies. So are you like, sending out like a text invite, like, hey, we're going to do a talk, what do you call it? A story?
Family
Talking
storytelling circle.
Yeah. And like, then you have to explain that. Like, what does that look like in your experience?
I'll answer that question in two parts. But the first is, you said people just want to get through it. And that's what we've been taught. In this culture, I said that death is one of those skills we learn. That's what we've been taught, is how to just get through it. And the kind of implication is you just put your head down, do all the things that need to be done, come out the other side as quickly as possible and as unchanged as possible. Right? That's a kind of protective process. But that's not actually how we heal. Death is transformative. It's transformative for the person who's died. It's transformative for everyone who's left behind. And we need help becoming new people. When someone we love dies, we change enormously. Part of us dies, the part who was with them. We grieve. There's a huge transformation we go through. And it's a kind of death that the living go through, a death of who they were to be born to who they're going to be now without this person. This culture doesn't support that. It says, take 2 days off and be back at work just as productive as you were before.
And don't cry.
And
at
don't
work.
cry. All exquisitely bad advice. So we have a cultural change to be making, and then it's how do we implement it? So the first thing is to realize and acknowledge, and the people who come to me as clients are these kind of people. They say, I want this death to be sacred. I want this death to be healing. I want my children and my grandchildren to find their way through this and be more resilient and more resourced and more equipped to deal with future deaths afterwards. That's very different than head down, get through. So the people who come to me are already thinking, wow, I'm interested in personal development. I'm interested in therapy. I'm interested in the care of my soul. I'm interested in change and evolution and growth and healing at an emotional and spiritual as well as physical level. So when those people come to me, become my clients, then it's a much easier process. That's what they want. So then when they're my clients, I meet with them. Ideally, I would meet people, and I don't actually see in-person clients as much anymore as I used to. Mostly I teach now, but meet people ideally 6 months. If they knew the death was coming 6 months before, that would give us a nice time to get ready. Get ready and learn the practical things and learn the spiritual things and process. There's a ton of processing that has to happen as you move towards your death, and then be prepared for the spiritual and emotional and logistical journey of dying. So at that point, I've been working with people. I've been involved when the person dies. I often will facilitate the funeral too, officiate the funeral. And so in that process, they look to me for guidance. And so I say, well, what's really a good thing to do now is a family storytelling circle. And they trust me and they say, okay, everything else has worked, let's do that. And that will be in a bigger flow. So when the person, if it was an expected death through illness or aging, then I will have been at the deathbed. Likely after the person dies. I'm not there usually when they die. We do a ceremony at the deathbed with their body. We might wash their body, care for their body, spend 2 or 3 days with the body. Then there might be another ceremony where the body leaves wherever it is, the house, the long-term care facility, and it goes to the funeral home. Maybe there's a ceremony as the body's cremated. This family storytelling circle is one ceremony in that series. Maybe there's then another one, and then there's the funeral. So it's part of a whole ritual sequence.
What you just described reminds me of weddings in India, where it's a week-long, 2-week-long, process. And there are these little stops along the way, and there's specific food at each stop and specific members of each family or friend circle, and, might be at different locations. And then the actual wedding happens.
And I was at a Jewish funeral burial ceremony. Funeral happened at the graveyard, or this part of it did. And there was a ritual procession with the body from the vehicle to the grave, and we stopped 7 times. We sort of wove through the funeral. We stopped 7 times and heard and did different things at each place. So all of these weddings, funerals, birth, they're not moments. Death is not a moment. It's the whole process of leaving the body, and integrating takes that time.
Well, and living is a part of the dying process. As I was preparing for this, I kind of had that very obviously, it's very obvious when you say it, but I had this, thought like, oh, well, I'm in the process of dying right now. But we don't really like to think about our lives as a journey to death, because we have painted death as very negative and sad, and it's not a launching point to a new place of consciousness. Even those of us that are like Christian and heaven and have that like traditional, what we would consider traditional Western framework, like it's still immensely sad and taboo to talk about, even if we have certain truths, spiritual truths that we consider capital T true. And so I wanted to ask you about something that you have talked about in other interviews, the importance of naming what's true. How is that important?
Oh, you said so many interesting things in there. I had a teacher who shared a great phrase with me, and he talked about unconditional cooperation with the unavoidable.
Oh,
isn't that beautiful?
Wow. It is.
It's another way of saying don't argue with reality. Or there's no point in arguing with reality, or it's a lot easier if you just accept reality, right? And there are spiritual traditions galore that teaches that. So
yeah, I was going to say that sounds super Buddhist.
Yes, exactly. And everybody else really understands that too. But yes, so unconditional cooperation with the unavoidable. It's hard to cooperate with something if we can't even talk about it. So naming what's true can be as simple as getting to the point where you can say, I'm dying, or he's dying. And that is a big process. Some of your listeners might resonate with this. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2019. All good, it's all clear now, I'm great. But I remember a very specific period where I had had the diagnosis, but I hadn't told anybody. And there's a thing that changes when you tell people. Same about, telling people you've had a miscarriage, or even telling people someone has died. Someone dies and you're at home with them, picking up the phone, putting the word out into the world. It's a big energetic step to take. But we can't move into the next phase of the journey. We talk about all those steps and all these places we see this as a journey until we can cross that. So when people are dying, sometimes they can't even talk about the fact that they're dying. And it's not that they're not smart people or that they're trying to be difficult. It's that it's too much. It's too much to face, to hold, to be present to. And in those situations, we need support, right? We need someone else. Ideally, we'd have a social structure, a cultural structure that was holding a space for us, but it doesn't. So naming what's true is, I'm dying. And, I think about a gathering I had with a family. The dad who had advanced cancer, and he had 2 young adult children and some spouses and the mom. And he died maybe a month after I met him. And in this conversation, I came to the house, and it was this thing where everybody in the house knew he was dying. He knew he was dying, the mom, the children, everybody knew he was dying, but nobody talked about it as a whole. The mom talked to the daughters one-on-one. The daughters talked to each other. The daughters talked to their spouses. Nobody talked to the dying person. He knew he was dying, and he had to hold that all by himself. So I came, and I do a lot of my work around coffee tables and living rooms. We sat in a circle around the living room, and it took 2 hours of me supporting and helping and inviting people into being able to be with this. And by the end of it, the elephant was out from under the rug. What was true, which everybody knew was true, we were naming. And there was this way people's shoulders dropped. It takes a lot of energy to hold a secret. Even if you're holding it because you think it's going to help people or you think you're doing it from a good heart. When that dropped, many, many things happened. One is people could actually allow themselves to feel their grief. It's hard to feel grief when you've got a bunch of protective pretense. And one of the son-in-laws said this, and I thought, oh, he's so beautiful. He said, I am so glad we've done this, because what it means is now we can make these last weeks or months, they didn't know how long it was going to be at that point, as beautiful as possible instead of pretending that everything is normal, because it's not normal. And so the image I often have is, at some point people are kind of all squished up to the edge of the room, looking around, looking at anything except what's in the middle of the room. And then when we have this conversation and we can name it, people then come and they stand side by side, all looking forward at the same future. They think, okay, we'll hold hands. We can move forward together, consciously in a way of choice towards this. But if you can't talk about it, you can't heal it.
I can really, really see why having an outsider like you is like that permission to have the conversation and to name what's true. But how do you encourage people to name what's true about themselves? Because I think part of what makes death taboo and what makes it difficult to speak about to one another is that it's that phenomenon in psychology where, if something makes you really mad about a person, it's usually because you're either afraid of becoming it yourself or you are already it yourself. It probably has a name. I don't know the name, but it's that visceral response that is the clue that this is something about you within you. And it's hard to name what's true about yourself. Like maybe you need to have a conversation with a parent, but having that conversation about maybe a business part of death, let's say the estate, it reflects back like, well, I haven't gotten my financial affairs in order. So like I'll talk about it later when I know what I'm talking about. I mean, that's just one example, but I feel like in every department of the dying process, there's an example where we don't talk to ourselves in a true way. How do you encourage people to talk to themselves about death in a way that's helpful?
We die the way we live, and we walk through the death of the people we love the way we live. And so therapy and becoming self-aware and being able to name what's true about yourself every single day is what grows a strong, mature, whole, healthy psyche. And so the more that's who you are, the more able you are to meet death that way. So that's part of it. It's not just, we can't just talk about death as a separate part of this. If people can't face all of those because they haven't had support or they've had too much trauma in their past, then that's across the board. People want to talk about it, but often they don't know how. Sometimes aging parents will come to me and say, I'm dying, but my kids don't want to talk about it. That's a very common one. Or people will say, my mother, father is dying, but they don't want to talk about it. So there's the kind of psychological denial that's built into that. And that's one thing we need to work on. But then there are just ways to approach that because sometimes people just don't have an on-ramp. They don't even know where to start. And so one of many ways to start is to talk about like, oh, Dad, I just got my will organized. Have you thought about yours? Right? Oh. Or, we just went to Aunt Mary's funeral. What did you think of that? Did you like that? What did you like about that? What didn't you like? So there's starting a little bit at a distance. We talk about somebody else. Or, I know you don't want to talk about death, but I need this. When you die, I'm going to be really upset, and it's going to be way harder for me if you don't. I know this is hard for me, but as my father, mother, spouse, brother, whatever, would you at least give me a little bit so I know that I can do what you would be wanting? So it's finding little on-ramps, and the truth is some people don't want to talk about it and never will. And we can't change that. We can create opportunities, open the space so it's available, let them know that we're there. Some people just won't, or can't talk about it. But as those who are supporting people we love, or as those who, if we're dying ourselves, opening the space and inviting people into it can go a long way.
So it sounds like your approach is slow drip versus come to Jesus talk, no pun intended. But you know what I mean? Like, sit down, we're going to have a talk. And it's like, it's the one talk and it never happens again. It sounds like it's a little bit better to slow drip, or as the kids say, soft launch the conversation.
Well, it's speaking of kids, it's the same thing with kids, right? You see a dead bug on the ground or a dead bird on the ground. Talk about death. All the places. Their stuffy gets so shredded, it has to be replaced or recycled or something. Talk about that's death, right? Give kids experiences and skills. The animal dies, the pet dies, right? Give that, even if it's the goldfish, give that a full, spacious, spiritual attention. So the kids learn in small ways how to face death and endings and the endings of relationships in a healthy way, so that when grandma dies or when a parent dies or a sibling dies, they have some tools in their toolbox. Same at the end. Talk about it regularly. That it's, so-and-so died. I wonder how that was. Or so-and-so's in the hospital and her kids are struggling with this as they make these decisions. What do you think about that? Oh, well, pass the salt. Make it normalized.
Pass the salt. I think I have a new t-shirt idea for you. That's brilliant. And I love the picture that you've painted about family members inserting their personalities into that, like you just did just now. I feel like I saw a little bit of like Sarah at her own kitchen table, like pass the salt, because my family particularly, like we have a very like sarcastic, funny, there's dad jokes. And so the idea that you could customize it to your own experience and not play a character that you saw in the movie is somewhat comforting.
And that's what's really important. You talked about your Viking ancestors and their burning ship, right? There's a shared cultural iconography, right? These images, the ship, the costumes, the songs, the prayers, the procession. There's a whole shared symbolism that is part of what makes that powerful. We don't have that shared symbolism here for people who most of my clients identify as spiritual but not religious. So in that case, we need to find symbols that resonate for us individually. And so, making your funeral and your end-of-life rituals resonate for you. I'm just thinking of a viewing and casket closing ceremony I did with a family. I'd worked with them all the way through and did the funeral as well. And the dad had died. He had been an accountant, but his real passion was to be a classic rock and roll guitar player. So he'd been in this old guy accountant classic rock and roll guitar band all his life. And he loved it. And they had a house that was full of classic rock. And when he died at the ceremony in the funeral home, he was in the casket. It was beautiful. Each person came up. They put a yellow rose in the coffin and talked about what they loved about him, what they'd missed about him, said goodbye, kissed him, touched him, saw his face and his body for the last time. Huge. Another one of those rituals between death and the funeral. And then comes the moment where we close the lid. And it's like at a wedding when the ring goes on the finger, right? That gesture changes everything. You can get unmarried 10 minutes later, but the ring going on, being pronounced, that changes something. So when the coffin lid closed and we made a big ritual about that, we had CCR playing at the top volume. And that was what made that meaningful for that family. So personalizing it and finding what's meaningful for you. In mainstream culture, we often neutralize things so they don't mean anything to anybody because they're kind of a blank slate. But within that, my invitation to people is really to find the elements that are meaningful to them.
I love that because that's authentic. That's a perfect example. Like the classic rock family, like those more formal funerals, I think that we've all attended at once in our lives, that doesn't sound like it would be a fit. So bringing some intention into the conversation, ideally before death happens, could allow for the event of that to be something that's not just meaningful, but memorable, and something that you can, as you pointed out, bring up in conversation. Hey, remember Uncle Joey's funeral where we, had the electric guitar, or whatever it is, like a memory that you can look back on.
I want to interject here because it's a really important point. This wasn't the funeral. This was the viewing and the coffin closing. And when we closed the coffin, the music turned off.
Oh, wow.
Right? So you feel that.
Yeah.
Right? That's the feeling. There's a way that when death is hard to talk about, and we have a culture that's all about the Instagrammable moment, and we have lots of people selling us things that are sparkly, right? Or it's almost like junk food symbolism. Yeah. We can have a lot of stuff. It's important that the symbols we choose honor the depth and the meaning of what's happening. Sometimes having a funeral that's full of classic rock and loud never lets you actually acknowledge what's really happening. It's another way of avoiding it. So the funeral is a very different thing. And the funeral can have moments. It has to have symbolism and moments that resonate, but it's a serious event. And holding that space to say goodbye. It's a fine balance between picking symbols that matter and also maintaining the real gravitas, the weight and significance of what it is, and not doing things just because you can.
Right.
Just because there's a gizmo you can buy or do, just because you can have your loved one's ashes shot into space in a rocket or into fireworks. Should you? Well, what's the spiritual significance? We're always looking at the soul significance. So it's pretty important. I can feel myself getting worked up about this because it's important. It's not just fun and fancy. It's meaningful. That's what's healing, is meaningful.
And that's why I think the role of the death doula is incredibly valuable, because you are just pulling these out of your vast library of experiences that you've had with other families, and in a way that would be so helpful if I was like an overwhelmed family member who either myself was looking at death or was trying to support a family member facing death, like to have your library of ideas, but also keeping us tethered in actually making it a helpful moment for mourning. I think, that combination is so special. And I think this is the right time to bring up the listener question that I have. She is a part of a group. It's the Young Lung Cancer Initiative group. And there's lots of teenagers in there who are facing terminal diagnoses. And so her question was, how would a death doula help a young person, and how would a parent know if the death doula is qualified to do so?
I'm going to speak just briefly to what you said previously. You said it's good to have someone there. It's important. When my dad died, one of my students came and helped because even though I know it, I'm the grieving daughter. Someone else had to hold the container. So it's really helpful to have somebody else come in. And I do have a library of all of these. I have a 5-part library where people can go on my site. So there's lots of more information there. A lot of that does exist because I tell it to so many people. Your question about death doulas leads into this. In 2015, 2012, I started practicing, and it sort of popped onto the scene. It's been going for a while. Of course, it goes back through time. But there are now a lot of people who are training death doulas and who have been trained as death doulas. It's a little bit like body work. 45 years ago, you could get a massage. That's it. Now, the kinds of body work, it's infinite. It's taken a while and it's got more specific. Death doulas were just at the beginning, and there's sort of one basket that all death doulas fit in, but actually death doulas within that basket do many, many kinds of things. And my prediction that is, in 20 years, the world of death support will be like the world of birth support. So many people who do so many different aspects of it. Right now, we just have sort of one name for the whole thing. So if you're looking, her question was, how would death doula help, and how do you know you're getting a death doula who's qualified? So how would a death doula help? It depends what kind of death doula you find. Some people are trained to be really kind of an intermediary between hospice care and the family. Families have never been on hospice before. They don't know how to do it. Here's someone who comes in between, who knows how to be that intermediary. Hospice might come a couple of times a week. The death doula can be there much more regularly. If you've never done something before, it's really helpful to have someone who knows that way, right? They're a little more pragmatic on the ground. Sometimes there are death doulas who do body work. They're hands-on practitioners. The work I do and the kind of death doula I am, I call myself a sacred death care guide. And so what I'm talking about and the people I train and the work that my organization talks about is more of this big, like, what's the soul's journey? And what are the ritual practices? So a death doula, depending on what kind of death doula you find or want or connect with, probably any of them would be helpful. All those things are useful to get. And so it's a little bit just who comes into your sphere and how do you make that choice. But know that not every death doula is trained the same way or has the same skills. And lots of people come into it with a lot of skills already, and they get this training. So they have more in their background. But really what it is someone who, at the minimum, starts before someone dies, lives through the dying, the death, the period after the death, and sometimes into the funeral. Everybody else stops and starts. Medical care goes to the death and funeral service goes after. A death doula carries you all the way through. So that's the basic, and that can be incredibly helpful because the moment and the days after a death are really disorienting unless you have help. So that's kind of the first answer. And then the second is talk to them. People come in with such different kinds of background. It's not really the training that's going to determine how good or skilled or not skilled they are, because some people will be incredibly skilled before and they come and they get some training and they learn a little bit. Some people don't have much background. They take a training. They know more, but they're still not that experienced. So really, I would look for personal connection, someone you like, and someone whose approach and attitude resonates with you. And probably most people who've gone through death doula trainings will have a lot more skill in their toolkit than people who haven't. So it's more about, do you like the person? It's not likely that they will cause you harm. You're not evaluating for someone who's going to fix your kitchen and you don't want your sink to leak. It's more, is this someone I want in my inner circle, who I enjoy being with, who can be another resource, who has a little more emotional distance and some experience? That itself is a gift. And then there's all the more specifics within that.
That's such a good point, because when you think about the process of dying, and we talked about like the unknowns versus the known, we tend to, a lot of us operate in that more, what's the word I'm looking for? That more carnal, more literal way of moving through the world. Like, these are the facts, and I'm operating by the facts and what I can see with my five senses, which is so funny because I recently learned most of what is reality is outside those five senses. So it's so funny that we brag about our full little five senses, right? But what you're saying is, when dealing with something that involves a lot more unknown than known when it comes to the journey of one's soul, that it's important to use those softer decider skills.
You know, a way I might say that is unseen.
Yeah.
Rather than unknown, right? It's the soul's journey, right? The soul doesn't respond to the five senses. You know, how do you measure how much you love someone? That's a soul thing. There's no number, and you can't count that, weigh it, measure it, see it, touch it. So they're these soul experiences. And so we need feeling-based, intuitive sensitivities. And it's energy. When body and soul separate, body is physical, soul is energy. So we need energetic intuition and intuitive skills and sensing. And so much of what I do when I walk into a room with people is feel what's going on. Oh, the grief is swirling around. It's all gray and foggy and gluggy. What do I need to do to clear this energy? Okay, we need to open the window. We need to do this and this. Okay, now it's feeling clearer. Those are legitimate ways of knowing and seeing the world and engaging with it. So it's a soul-based thing. But in dominant culture, we don't have any space for the soul. We have space for all the pragmatic things. Book the funeral, get the coffee, all that kind of stuff. We don't have a language or a pattern for talking about the other.
Yeah, yeah. When it comes to helping those who are themselves facing death, have psychedelics played any helpful role in kind of reconciling that truth for them?
Psychedelics are incredibly valuable. It's not something I work with. I mean, not directly, not professionally. What psychedelics can do is take us into that energetic dimension that's not the here, now, linear, physical realm. We go into different dimensions. We can see past and present. We have some of the filters that hold us in this structure soften so we can see other things. So psychedelics can be really valuable, and there are people who do that work. That's not me. I find that the work I do, and there's the ritual work, which is about processing in the moment as you go through. And then I do these in-person gatherings called Across the Veil Constellations, which is in a way takes you into that same zone, but it's not with psychedelics.
Is that like a death meditation?
No, it's not a meditation at all. It's very embodied group practice for people who know family systems constellations. It's a bit of a modification of that, but it's a way of ritually entering into a space where people can bring resolution to either upcoming deaths or unresolved deaths from the past. And it's one of those things that's almost impossible to describe, but it's kind of amazing. And people come out and they're not afraid of dying anymore. Or they understand that the ancestors really will be waiting when they get there, and they understand it here, or they know that it was okay for the cat to euthanize it. So psychedelics are an altered state of consciousness, and ritual is an altered state of consciousness. So we can get to some of the same zones by doing deep ritual practice as we can through psychedelics. The work I do, psychedelics are amazing. The work I do, I think, has some added value that it's A, the bar is lower, you don't have to take the medicine, and B, you can do it together. So a family can come and have the same experience, whereas psychedelics is all individual.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I am so glad we met already, and we're not even done. I have a couple more questions for you, but wow, I just want to like kind of sit in this moment for a second. This is so incredible. I love that there's so many on-ramps to this as individuals, how we talk to ourselves about death. And then you've already discussed so many on-ramps, drips, if you will, of talking to others about death and talking to the dying about death. I want to come back to ritual for a second, because everything that we're talking about has a very visceral weight to it. I mean, you're talking about dynamic family relationships. You're talking about the physical energy when you walk into someone's living room. These are all very real spaces that you're in. But death rituals also have a digital version now. And I'm wondering what your take is on that. I've seen people blog about the death process of their loved ones on various platforms, post pictures of their dead or dying loved ones. We've all seen, you know, the hand where you're holding the dying person's hand in the hospital bed. And I have so many thoughts about like, oh, well, did they agree to that? And I don't know. And some of them, you know, are children, like they, you know, like the baby dies, it's stillborn, and then there's like a photo shoot afterwards. And I could definitely see from a ritual standpoint how these would be personally valuable. But what's your take on the social sharing part of that?
It's a lot in that question. So yes, consent, you know, as a baseline is important. You wouldn't want to do anything that the person would not want you to do, right? That's the baseline. But it's interesting, you know, in Western culture, we have things very individually assigned. This is the person who died. But actually, it's a relational process. If your child dies, you have lost a child. And both of those dynamics are important and intense and difficult. And so people need spaces to be able to talk about their own experience. I lost a child. That lives in them. And it's the child too. So again, it's taking us out of the sort of mainstream cultural frame and saying, oh, relationship, soul, these things are a bigger process. I think what's wonderful about some of the ways this is going online is that we're breaking the taboo. The internet loves a good kind of clickbait, and some of these things can be shocking and clickbait. So we don't want to go down that path. But there's so many people writing and sharing beautiful, heartfelt, personal stories about their experience. And they're giving people the opportunity to see that it doesn't have to be done the same way we've always done it, to see that there are different ways to do it, and to destigmatize and de-isolate, if that's a word, people who are struggling. Like, oh, they had this experience. I wish I'd done that. I'm going to do this the next time. So as long as it's kept in the energy of respect, what's shared in there can actually be incredibly helpful in this campaign we're on to destigmatize and normalize these situations. They're sad and they're hard, and we need to treat them with respect, but it should be okay to talk about them.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I always come to the conclusion that society is spaghetti, not waffles. It's something that came up on an episode I did a long time ago about mental health. But we have this expectation sometimes that individualized is the word that you said. And I always think of the space in between the little waffle walls. Like, that's where the syrup lives. That's where our morning lives, or that's where our individualized experience lives. But truly, it's spaghetti noodles and they're all intertwined. And if they sit on the counter overnight, the next morning they're really stuck. And, like that's the real life of it. I have so enjoyed this conversation. Before we wrap up, if you're comfortable sharing, I'm curious to know how you would want your funeral or the rituals around your own death to look like.
My family has come to talk about death very regularly. I mean, we always kind of did, which is probably why I do this work. So it's a common conversation in my family. We talk about it so much, and we just have the kind of relationship, my sister, my nieces, my mom, that I just trust that whatever they do, I would be okay with. Like, they know me so well, and they know what I do. So I don't know when I'm going to die. I don't know who's going to be who or where's going to be where, when it's going to happen. So I actually don't spend a lot of time engaged in that, because I trust when I'm the one dying, or if I die suddenly, they'll know. Right? But I'll want it to be meaningful. I'll want it to be intentional. I'll want it to be something that brings people together, right? And gives people an opportunity to mourn together. Laurie Anderson, wonderful musician, when her husband Lou Reed died, she said, "I've come to believe that the purpose of death is the release of love." So I'm not so concerned about what it looks like or what color the flowers are. I'm more concerned, for me and for all the people I work with, that a death creates beauty because of what happens. We come together. People know what a good funeral is. It's sad, but it was a good funeral. It feels good. That's the beauty. So I want mine to release love in whatever way that can happen.
Oh, so beautifully said. Where can people engage with more of this type of conversation with your center, or with you, or with those you've trained?
So the website is the centerforsacreddeathcare.com, and I'm Sacred Death Care on all the social media platforms, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, probably something else out there too, but Sacred Death Care will find me on all of those. And I post regularly. I have lots going on there, and I teach. So I have a library of courses for people who are facing their own death or someone else's death, and they just need a handbook to walk through the process with. And it's for families and caregivers and curious death doulas and practitioners. And then I have a longer, more extensive training program. It's a 13-week course, and it happens twice a year. And you can find all those details on my site too.
Wow. Thank you so much. Again, so great to meet you. Thank you for sharing this conversation with me. This was perfect.
Lovely to meet you too, Meredith. Thank you very much.